In our survey of Bible history, it is amazing to me that we are already on stage 3 of Dr. Wilmington's 12 basic stages in the Book of Ages. We have been to the creation stage, and we've watched God create man in his own image. We've watched the fall, we've watched the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And from there, we saw God concentrate on one family, Abraham's family, to begin to bless the whole world as a result through his efforts with that one family. First Abraham, and then Isaac, then Jacob, then Joseph, and in the end, 72 of his family are in Goshen in Egypt, about to grow and to become a big nation. So this is the third stage in Wilmington stages. This is the Exodus stage. The Exodus stage parallels closely the life of Moses. So it's approximately 180 years, and Moses' life divides neatly up into three sections, each of 40 years. So his first 40 years, he spends them living and training and growing up in Pharaoh's world as the son of the daughter of Pharaoh. And this 40-year period ends with him identifying himself with the Jewish people, with their plight, and trying to deliver by his own merit. As a result, he runs for his life and spends the next 40 years living in the desert, hiding, beginning again, starting over, and then God calls him and draws him back into uh, Egypt, back into the role of deliverer, in order that God might use Moses to deliver his people from Egypt and back into the promised land. So let's look at each of these stages. In the end of the patriarchal stage, or the beginning of the Exodus stage, there was about a 400-year span from when we left Joseph in Egypt until, and this is interesting for the reputation of Joseph, it took a long time for them to forget the grace that came to their nation through Joseph. Because 400 years later, then it says, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. The previous ones must then have also loved and respected and remembered what Joseph had done. But this one rises, perhaps because now there are so many Jews that they now have become a nation that is rivaling the size of Egypt itself, and so causing some political instability or worry that they could join with the enemies of Egypt and bring about its overthrow. So instead, the Jewish people are bound over into slavery. So their privileged status in Goshen now becomes a place of slavery. And it is into that scene that Moses is born. His name means drawn from the Nile. It's a name given to him not by his mother, but by the Pharaoh's daughter, who finds him, draws him out of the Nile in that little basket that his mother had made for him. He's given the finest education, all the wealth and the prosperity that he could imagine, and yet it seems from the beginning he has known that he is a member of the race of slaves that are living in the midst of all of Pharaoh's world. And so Moses begins to move, hopefully by way of delivering, but ends up in his own hands, bringing about the murder of an Egyptian, and then bringing about the need to run, which will begin his second 40 years, this one in the desert, because of the murder, because of the attempt to deliver Israel in his own strength. He will spend the next 40 years in the desert, wandering as sheep herder. God will give him a family, and during that time, a lot of humility is learned from desiring to deliver God's people through your own strength or until God calls you and begins to work through you to deliver God's people in his strength. And of course, that's what's going to happen when God finally calls Moses again to use him to deliver the people. He is 80 years old and beginning that last third 40 years. So God calls him, he returns, he works with Pharaoh to try to bring about the freedom of the Jews. There are the series of plagues, as you remember, and then the Exodus itself. And then Moses is the leader through the Exodus, not only through the Red Sea, but through the desert and up to the Promised Land, where they spy out the land and yet are afraid to enter. And so the Jewish people are judged in the next 40 years. The rest of that third period of Moses' life is spent wandering because they will not have faith to walk into the Promised Land. So that's our Exodus stage. It is primarily the life of Moses. It goes 40 years in Pharaoh's company, 40 years in the desert, and then 40 years in Exodus and wandering. Pay careful attention when you go into the discussion of the plagues. When you read the plagues, note a couple of things, because the author, the writer, Moses, is pointing out some details that are really interesting. In the plagues, he is calling out the gods of Egypt, gods over the Nile, gods over who are responsible for a variety of things. He is showing that Moses' God is more powerful than the gods of Egypt. Pharaoh himself is a kind of god, and so this is in the plagues, God calling out Pharaoh. He should have the power to stop what's happening, and he is powerless to stop what is happening before the face of Moses because of the power of God. And then watch as the plagues are discussed. There are some details that are shared that are pretty interesting to watch. One is listen to when the magicians try to repeat what the miracles are that Moses is doing. So they eventually come to an understanding of who God is long before Pharaoh does. And then secondly, some of the plagues show a distinction between what is happening to Egypt and what is happening to Goshen, where God's people are. So God in the plagues sometimes draws a distinction between the two, and that even adds to sort of the tension between Pharaoh and Moses. And then finally, watch as Pharaoh tries to offer compromises. You can go, but don't go very far. You could go, but leave your family here. You could go, but leave your herds and your cattle here. There's compromises that he offers. Don't go far away. They have to do with distance and wealth and family. What Pharaoh is attempting to do is to keep control of them, but yet bring about an end to these plagues that are ravaging his nation. And then we come to the Exodus itself. It's interesting that in Goshen, as they have begun to do archaeological studies, there's evidence of slavery. There's evidence that a once prosperous nation is now becoming malnourished. And so that's an interesting picture that's coming. And then this group of Semites, they disappear altogether. And what is happening with that in the archaeological record? But we will find by the time of Ramses, Israel is a nation already in Canaan. So the archaeological record dovetails nicely with what the scripture says is happening in the Exodus. Of course, the last of the plagues is the Passover, and then as the oldest, the firstborn of every household is died unless there was blood placed on the doorposts, God gives, in perhaps fear or in perhaps of trying to rush the Jewish people out of the nation, they could ask for anything, and the Egyptians would give it to them, as long as they would leave and bring about an end to the plagues. And so, in that way, the Jewish people plundered the Egyptians. And of course, when they got to the Red Sea, Pharaoh changed his mind, and so all of God's people are standing between a rock and a hard place, or better, Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. And so there is no movement to be able to escape. There is only the Red Sea or Pharaoh's army, and God makes a way right through the Red Sea and into the other side of the sea, into heading for Mount Horeb. So that's where we get kind of the story of the Exodus. That period will end with 40 years wandering, because as they go to spy out the land that God has promised to them, they see that it's a wonderful land, it's a prosperous land, it's a fruitful land, and yet because of the enemies that are there, because they are big, and because they would look like grasshoppers to them, the spies come back. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, but we can't go there because they're too big. They discount the God who offers them entrance into the promised land. Two of the spies, of course, and you know, Caleb and Joshua, are the two who give a good report, and they are the only two from that generation who will ever go in to the promised land. Everybody else was rejected, and because they rejected God, God rejected them. They felt bad about it. They went to war, and they lost soundly as a result of trying to pull it off in their own strength. I can't imagine a worse kind of ministry than having 40 years of ministry with the people where you're just waiting for everybody to die so that the next generation can begin again where that generation left off, where that generation failed. So that's the way the Exodus stage ends. You have Moses' birth, and you have Moses on the backside of the desert. Then you have him in the last 40 years with the Exodus and leading God's people, but still they cannot get in to the promised land. And so the story will end with Moses appointing new leadership in Joshua. Moses himself will die in the mountains on the east side of the Jordan, and his opportunity to be in the promised land will not come until Christ is here. And at the transfiguration, Moses finally gets to be in the land that God has promised, and that he led God's people to the brink of entering. So it's an interesting thought. That's the Exodus stage, and I'm grateful that you hung out and walked with me through it. We'll talk again.